Director of Project Development at Shuruq, and Mr. Dara Tawhidi, Partner and Architect at Foster and Partners. Welcome, everyone.
Hello.
Hello. To begin with, I would like to get to know more about what the term sustainability mean to you in your field. What is the difference between green architecture and sustainable architecture? Dara, if you would like to give us your thoughts on that.
Sure. Well, thanks for the introduction, Najla. So when we talk about sustainability, it's often split into three different terms. People talk about environmental sustainability, social and economic sustainability. And as professionals in the design industry, the one we often know best is the environmental sustainability. So that talks about how we use energy, how we use water, how we recycle waste, how we use transport, and the relationship of those things to the natural environment. And I think that's what most people think about when you use the term green architecture. It's obviously incredibly important. It's something we take very seriously, and we try to bring it into all of our projects. When you look at the green rating systems that a lot of us work with, like LEED or BREEAM or Estidama, they tend to have more of a focus on that environmental aspect. But of course, as you mentioned, sustainability has become something much broader, and it encompasses those social and economic factors. And for us, we always try to bring those into our designs. We try to really think about those aspects as well. A lot of it has, until recently, almost been intuitive with, particularly with the social side of sustainable design. But it's begun to be more codified now. And the reference for us really is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which were defined around, from around 2012. They were finalized and published in 2015, and they set out 17 goals that the world has come together and agreed are the kind of the most important foundations of sustainable human development. And it really refers to the word development in that context, refers to the development of human beings and how we can sustain humanity on Earth. It's not so much development in the commercial aspect that we're kind of used to as architects. And so those sustainable development goals are our guide, and we try to measure our projects against all 17. And so they include things like poverty. They include, access to to pleasant, healthy spaces. They include equality, across genders and so on. And we've actually started to map those things in addition to the kind of more traditional energy performance.
Great. Nada, what are your thoughts on the do you agree? Do you disagree? How do you see this?
Well, firstly, thank you, Najla, for the introduction. And yeah, of course, I agree. And I think, it's looking at sustainability as a whole, as a holistic way. It's really, not comparing between what's green, what's sustainable. I think both work well together and should be considered as an integral part of the design process. So I think sustainability is more of a way of approaching a certain project or a problem. So every project poses different questions, different problems, and each project has a specific set of factors and ideas around it, which designers can tap into and integrate within the design. It is not just imposed on the design period, but it carries throughout construction and the lifetime of the building. So I think it's not just sufficient for saying that, oh, we designed a sustainable building, but also thinking about the afterlife, after the construction, the duration of construction itself, but even after the building is completed, how would it be operated? How would the inhabitants, you know, live within this building in a more sustainable way? Each project has its own specific set of factors and parameters that need to be looked at individually. So I think there are specific sustainable measures that could be applied, you know, on all projects, whether it's, you know, employing methods of conserving water or conserving power. But then also each project is specific in its nature, whether it's context, its location, you know, the resources available in that location itself. So it's important to look at each project individually and to actually integrate sustainability within as a process within the design itself, and not just, you know, something considered as nice to have or an add-on.
Yeah, it's not just like you're ticking the checklist. It's much more than that. I definitely agree. Hawla, what do you think?
So for me, I totally agree with both of my colleagues, Dara and Nada. To me, sustainability is such a bigger concept, and it's a more encompassing umbrella. And the frustration I find is that in mainstream media, for example, or what has happened is that it is now seen as an extra, whereas, you know, sustainability has always been something that all architects would feel like this is a sort of like an integral part of the process. And nowadays you would have conversations with some people, and it's like, oh, sustainability, that's an extra scope that we have to undertake. And I think now more than ever, this should not be seen as an extra scope that we have to undertake. This is the responsibility of each and every one of us, architect, designer, developer, whoever we are. When we do build in the built environment, we do understand the impact that we have on the built environment, and whatever we design and build is designed to stay and to last. So it is such a huge responsibility that we have in our hands. And with lots of our projects, for example, we have these regenerative projects where we regenerate some of the old buildings. And I feel like a lot of these are not necessarily understood straight away, that this is one of the best ways, in my personal opinion at least, to talk about sustainability or to practice sustainability. Because maybe it's a generational thing. In our generation, we're just used to discarding whatever is old or whatever has been used or whatever is not pretty anymore or does not have the same function that it used to have anymore. We're just used to discarding it. And on the contrary, just by breathing new life into it and giving it a new use, and you know, just making it modern and making it contemporary and giving it life and allowing it really to bring income to itself, in my opinion, is one of the epitomes of the definition of sustainability, because then it allows itself to sustain itself financially, as well as, you know, in the stories and in the depth of, for example, an old house that is now not just a museum that you visit, but really a functional building, whether it's a cafe or a hotel or whatever it is. Like, when people visit it, they understand the history behind it and the depth. So in my opinion, that is one of the more encompassing definitions of what sustainability really is.
Yeah, and I mean, demolishing buildings is, again, you're basically putting out all that carbon back in the environment, and you're building again, and you're using your footprint as well. So definitely.
Yeah, one of the ways to think about what Kaula just said is the idea of embodied carbon. So very often we're used to thinking about the energy a building consumes when it's in use, but actually the energy that's gone into producing the material of the building is also really, really important. And when you factor in things like fit out, where you're changing you're changing the materials on a quite regular basis, and you're changing maybe some of the plant, that embodied carbon that's kind of in the materials is a big element of the energy or carbon use that's in a building. So if you can actually reuse a building, it is one of the most effective means you've got of reducing carbon over the whole kind of life cycle of a project.
I totally agree with Dara, and honestly, even touching upon what Nada was saying earlier about the design period, the construction period, and the operations period. So I feel like it is, again, our responsibility to make sure our footprint is minimized throughout this whole process of design, construction, and operations. Sometimes we do something brilliant in the design and it's all for the, glitz of going into the magazines and this and that, but is it really truly fulfilling all of its goals when it comes to operating it?
Definitely. In light of the current global events, such as the pandemic and the call for social equity, how are you as a decision maker or a designer addressing the topic of social sustainability and conscious architecture, like in cities and the built environment? What have you already been applying, for example, or what are the lessons learned even? Dara, maybe you can let us know.
Sure. So, architecture for us is always fundamentally about people. So that social aspect of creating pleasant spaces for people to be in is really, is really kind of driven everything we do, I think, from the earliest days of the practice. So whether it's rethinking about how a workplace operates, if you go right back to some of the early buildings that Foster & Partners did, like the Willis Faber building in Ipswich in the 1970s, that was one of the first open plan office buildings. It was one of the first office buildings to bring in staff amenities. So you had this idea, you had a swimming pool on the roof, for example, and you had places for staff to relax and eat their lunch on a roof terrace. It had a big green roof. It had places to get away from your desk. I mean, these things in the 70s were massively forward-looking. So whether it's a project like that, or whether we're looking at a project like the House of Wisdom, which we've just been designing and we're in the process of finishing for Shahrukh, and that project's very much about creating a inclusive, open space for all types of people to come together, and that was the kind of genesis of the name, because it referred back to this old model almost that gave rise to the modern day university in the Arab world called the House of Wisdom. So those aspects of, as I said in the last question, they've almost been intuitively considered in everything we do. But it's starting to get, I think, more codified now and more measurable how we address these things. So if you look at environmental sustainability, it's very easy to measure. So you can say, well, how much energy are we using? How much carbon are we saving by changing material X for material Y? When it comes to the social aspects of sustainability, it's a bit harder to measure. It's difficult to say, how has a particular space affected someone's day? You can't always put a number on that. But one area where it is a bit more measurable and quantifiable is in the workplace. Particularly in the current world where we've got this whole concern about wellness in our workplaces. The ideas of wellness and sustainability are kind of really intrinsically connected. So, if you take an example of natural ventilation in a building, I think we're all very conscious about recirculating air in buildings these days. And, perhaps that's not the most healthy way for us to design our buildings. And we've been sort of pushing natural ventilation in a lot of our projects for a long time. And it's taken on a kind of renewed relevance in the current world, where not only are you creating a more healthy environment, but you're creating one that's using a lot less energy. So it's really interesting how these different pieces of sustainable design come together and connect.
Nada, do you Would you like to add on to that?
Yeah, I mean, just touching on Dara's point on these qualities cannot be very much measured, but I think, you know, just taking the learnings from the current situation, I think we all have a commitment towards taking this issue more seriously. And we have seen how, you know, it affects us globally. And, you know, how something like a pandemic can change the way that we live, the way that we work. And we have a great opportunity to rethink the way that we design and to create spaces that are more flexible, that could adapt, you know, for future unforeseen events, and touching on how healthy, you know, buildings are. So, you know, like sustainability is something nice to have. Also, you know, I think just healthiness is something that could be mandated, you know, moving forward, whether it's a new building that's going to be designed or just retrofitting our current built environment into creating more favorable interior spaces for the inhabitants or employees. And I think, you know, that directly relates to the well-being of the employees when, you know, a building is sustainably designed, takes into consideration the social aspect of the building as well. So I think there are so many learnings that we can take forward. And as you know, as practitioners in this industry, we have a responsibility towards addressing all of these issues moving forward, and to take them more seriously, and to, you know, and to have them embedded within all of the processes moving forward, and to think about how can we reduce the negative impacts that we have on the environment, on the health and well-being of people, of workers, of employees. There are so many measures to do. How and Dara mentioned about, you know, the interior environment, about ventilation, about air quality, about measuring all of these air quality aspects. And I think we, in this current day and age, we could, you know, make use of the technology that we have to monitor all of these things. So we can use technology in our benefit and integrate it within our built environment to help us address all of these issues and find solutions for them. You know, there's also the policy-making side of things. So, you know, the work from home has been proven that it exists and it could work even better than, you know, actually working from the offices. And to take that on forward on a more permanent basis, because you know, it does affect the well-being of employees. It does affect the commute, you know, of employees from, you know, from their home to their workplace, and that also has an impact on our environment, on, you know, cities, like it creates more traffic, things like that. So I think all of these ideas would need to be studied further and need to be implemented on a more permanent basis. And we shouldn't just take this period for granted. And we do need to take those learnings and build on them and have them integrated more within our design processes.
Definitely. Hola, I see you nodding. So do you, I feel like you agree.
I agree. But for me, when it comes to social sustainability, I feel like it is 100% linked to as well inclusivity in design. And I find that, I mean, as Dara was talking about the House of Wisdom, one of the lessons where we learned how to really design inclusively was on that project. And partly is by just forgetting that you are the sole person that is, you know, you're the designer or you're the owner of this project, but really putting on the 1,013 hats that you need to put on. That what if I was, you know, a woman? Would a woman feel comfortable in this space? Would a child feel comfortable in this space? Would a person with special needs feel comfortable in this space? And you know, what more than a library, which is a social hub that is going to bring everyone together for us to test this on. And that is why we have, like Nada was saying, there are the technologies nowadays for us to monitor these things and the performance of a building, not only when it comes to energy, but also how it's performing when it comes to, you know, how well we designed it for people. And how friendly is it for the users, and how easy is it for them to enjoy and for them to really take advantage of all of its properties. And we have looked into that, and hopefully one day when it will be open very, very soon, we will be able to, all of us, enjoy all of its facilities. And nothing makes me happier than, for example, when we do go to any of our projects, and many of them are public regenerative projects, that we get to see, you know, how the kids are enjoying it, how the teenagers are enjoying it. And they sometimes tend to be the forgotten age where nothing really caters to them. But we try to make sure that everyone is catered for. And, you know, just by becoming a mother at some point in time, it changes your perspective too much. So you start looking at things in a different way. So I feel like when it comes to inclusive design, or if you're designing for everyone, you need to put on so many hats. And the ego of the architect or the ego of the designer of me and I know it all and I can do it better starts to take a back seat, because you are designing for people who are going to use the space and enjoy it and, you know, thrive in it. So again, nothing makes us happier than seeing a family spend their time in Khorfakan Beach, whether jogging or in a cafe, and feeling comfortable and really making use of the spaces just like we envisioned them. Or if they did not, or if they found another way of using these spaces, then we learn from that for our next project or for the same project, because I don't think any project stops the moment we construct it. We like to learn from that as well and take feedback and constantly evolve the projects that we work on. Again, still for the people. That's the ultimate goal, I think.
I definitely agree with everything said, 100%. Nada, I would like to go further into discussing the BIA headquarters and really touch upon these, the measures that have been taken during the design, construction, and operation, you know, phase in the future in terms of sustainability.
So the BIA headquarters is inspired, the concept of it is inspired by its context, which is the desert. It's a series of a couple of intersecting dunes that forms the overall form of the building. The building reflects the company's vision of digitalization and sustainability. So in terms of sustainability, we're hopefully aiming to receive the LEED Platinum rating, which is the highest rating under the US GBC. We've also integrated smart technology within the building to create a more seamless experience for the employees and for the visitors. The building is due to receive visitors. We have a gallery space. We have a visitor center where we tell the story of BIA, of sustainability, of the building itself. We have an auditorium. We have outdoor courtyards, a cafe space. So it's not just an office building, but also a more engaging public space. The building is going to be powered using solar energy. We're also storing the surplus of energy on battery power packs. We're using landscaping that uses native plants that don't require a lot of water consumption. We're using water efficient fixtures within the building to reduce the consumption of water. We're also utilizing LED lights within the interior, the exterior, so to reduce the power consumption as well. We're using a content of recycled materials. A vast majority of the materials are actually produced locally in Sharjah, so to reduce the transport time between the production factory and the site itself. So in terms of smart technology, we're also taking it a step further. So the smart technology is also tied into the building management system of the building. So in the future, it would add on an artificial intelligence level where the engineering of the building optimizes the operating systems within the building. But even further, after learning over a pattern and over the years, it could adapt to the consumption patterns of the building, but also efficiently uses the systems and optimizes them even further. During construction, we're recycling all of the waste. The waste from the construction site itself goes to our waste management complex, which is across the road. We're using solar energy wherever we need power and light at night. So we're aiming to set a new standard of green buildings. This concept that sustainable building needs to look a certain way, I think we're trying to break that idea, and by creating an iconic landmark of this sort, but still making it sustainable. I think we're trying to push people to think about sustainability and about their built environment in a more environmental friendly ways.
Great. I mean, it's amazing that you have the education center that raises awareness, and that by itself is definitely a huge tool to advocate for sustainability and teach the future generations about it. So it's great to hear about all these.
Yeah, because we have our School of Education, and we do receive a lot of school visits, and you know, they want to learn about recycling and about you know, how can they contribute positively towards their environment. And I think it's a great chance for us to tell that story within that space and to show them, you know, what BIA is doing and how are we doing it and how are we thinking about the future as well.
Amazing. Beyond sustainable architecture and towards a more responsible architecture, with the rapid population growth, we would need around 2.4 billion urban residences worldwide by 2050. And with the issues in climate change, our buildings need to be carbon neutral by 2030. So my question to you, Dara, is how is Foster and Partners contributing towards that goal?
So it's probably just worth talking a little bit about the United Nations Paris Climate Agreement, which was it was signed, if you like, in 2015, and that sets goals for the whole world to essentially, you know, manage the effects of climate change. And it's actually part of international law. I mean, it's just interesting in case anyone who's listening in isn't sort of familiar with the Paris Climate Agreement. It is part of international law. It's designed to be binding. And what it fundamentally says is the countries of the world have got together and they've agreed that we have to limit climate change to not more and preferably substantially less than 2 degrees from pre-industrial levels. And then it sets out a sort of pathway of how you would achieve that. And one of the main means of achieving it is to, as you said, to get to a situation where buildings are zero carbon initially, and then ultimately buildings are climate restorative. So, you know, a project would actually take carbon out of the atmosphere potentially. And you know, within the agreement, there's this idea of balancing carbon emissions and carbon absorptions. So that's that's been a big wake-up call, I think, for the architectural industry and the construction industry, because what this agreement says is we have to achieve some pretty ambitious targets, you know, and there's this target of being, you know, completely imbalanced by 2050, and making sure we don't raise temperatures by more than 1.5 degrees. So what we have done as a practice is we've actually put a whole series of ways of working in place where we're able to really focus on this ambition of limiting carbon. And we have a team within the office that works with all the architects, and they've developed software where we can actually analyze all the bits that go into a building, all the pieces, all the, you know, the structure, the steel structure, the concrete, the glass, all the interior finishes. And when we make a decision, we can actually see what effect that has on the carbon budget of a building. So much as you would with a quantity surveyor, look at the financial budget, the amount of money you're spending, we're able to now look at the amount of carbon we're spending in a project, and we're, with our clients, able to make decisions to reduce carbon. And then we get to a position where, you know, we're doing the most efficient building possible. You know, one of the things we've discovered in doing that is how much carbon there is embodied in glass. And I talked a bit earlier about the difference between operational carbon and embodied carbon. So again, the carbon that's in the materials. You know, so one of the big changes you can make is just don't use too much glass on a building. And that's from the embodied carbon point of view, not just from the energy use side. And what we're getting to is a position where we still can't make buildings carbon neutral, but then we can work with our clients to offset, if you like, the carbon budget of the building. So once you've factored in the operational carbon, the embodied carbon, you've factored it over 50 years, we can work with our clients in a kind of after service to say, right, how can we offset that? And it's one of the things we've looked at in our office in London, and we've actually looked at planting forests, new forests in the UK to actually offset the carbon that we're using within our London campus. So we're really kind of pushing these things internally as well as with the projects we're designing. Now, one sort of more thing I want to add on that is when we've been doing this research, we've discovered that a lot of the rating systems that are in use at the moment, like LEED and like BREEAM and so on, if you do the analysis and compare them to what the Paris Climate Agreement says, none of them achieve the 2 degree or 1.5 degree temperature rise. So we have to go a lot further. And that's really the big challenge for our industry, is to very quickly get into a position where we're meeting those targets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Khawla, I would like to ask you about like, how do you see the near future as far as sustainability is concerned? What's your vision? Not necessarily, let's say 2030, but even like now, the coming years. How, as a decision maker or a designer even, do you think this should be tackled?
So the people who know me might get surprised, but I am an optimistic person, and by nature. So I feel like the future is bright, and more people are aware of this, and more people are feeling very responsible towards it. And I think, yes, as much as designers and architects are aware and are trying to change, what is happening now is that clients and investors and even the business community is starting to understand the problem. And that is, I think, where and policymakers and politicians forget the one politician that we all are thinking about. Everyone else is as well completely embracing this idea and believing in it. And that is where I think change is going to happen. And for me, it's more of the same in the future, but same what? Same you know, same thrive to do better, same constantly wanting to learn more, constantly wanting to use whatever is out there in terms of technologies and in terms of knowledge and in terms of research that has already been done and is already ongoing, to constantly better ourselves and better our projects and better the built environment that we are responsible for. So more of the same, but I think what we're doing in Sharjah and in Shuruq is something that is slightly different and progressive in a way that we are pushing boundaries. And I'm saying this proudly, but also with a lot of, I'm humble as I say it, because I feel like the reason why we do this is because we wanted to contribute to the learning process. So if someone did a project today and we benchmark this project for our project next year, then whatever it is that we're contributing here is something that we want eventually for someone to benchmark in the future and contribute to the learning process and to the betterment of you know, where we are technologically, where we are in terms of all of these sustainable aspects. So whenever we do benchmark a project and something similar already exists, then what really are we doing? How are we adding value? Not much. So that's where I feel like we constantly want to push boundaries. We constantly want to improve. We constantly want to find out what is out there. How can we do it better? And I think, Najla, you of all people are a part of this, and you understand you know, the passion that we have for this kind of thing, and that we constantly want to be very, very responsible about every step that we take. More regenerative projects, because I feel like that as well has changed a lot of, I mean, now when we see projects in other cities, in other parts of our world that are regenerative, we are very proud to say that, you know what, maybe we have as well influenced people in thinking, let's not discard this building, or let's try and do something about it. And maybe, yes, in terms of cost and in terms of time that is required, it might be, you know, time consuming and more costly and all of that, but the benefits of it really surpass all of these complications that might come with it. So that's the future for me. The future is bright. I think we will get to do better. I think we will be able to achieve, you know, change, positive change in the environment. And I'm very positive about that.
Great. I've been looking quickly through the Q&A we have. Thank you everyone, first of all, for everyone here in the panelists for your amazing insight. And thanks to everyone who has been posting questions. One question that I noticed is, like, after COVID-19 and after getting into the new normal, let's say, do you think that more factors, perspectives, and metrics should be considered or incorporated into the planning and building process? And I would like to answer that from a sustainability point of view. Just like we were talking about social sustainability, that sort of thing. We have, yes, the LEED certification, the WELL certification, Istidama, everything else. Do we envision seeing other, you know, certifications, let's say, if that actually measure the factors that we have mentioned? Do you think
I could?
About these? Anyone can jump in and feel free.
Yeah, I've just a small thing to say about that. I think Norman said recently that he thinks the coronavirus pandemic is really just going to accelerate trends that were already in place, and I think that's very, very true. So some, you know, the things we've talked about, creating a healthy working environment, these were things that were already happening, but it's there's a much greater consciousness about it, and I hope there'll be a much bigger push towards really exploring those ideas. And then the idea of just more flexibility about how people work. I think we've discovered that we can be very productive at home, and perhaps it isn't necessary for us all to be kind of chained to our desks 9 hours a day, 5 days a week. And again, that's not a new idea. I mean, it's been around for a long time. We designed a headquarters recently in Dubai for a technology company, and that was all about, for the chairman of that company, it was all about how do I get people to actually come to the office, because people in the technology industry, they can equally well work from home. So this idea of how do we create workplaces that offer you something you can't get when you work from home? How do they give you that social interaction? They give you amenities which are, you know, beyond what you could have otherwise. So that's the, yeah, I think the really exciting thing is what trends that we found fascinating before are now going to be accelerated.
Yeah.
I completely agree with Dara. Like, the acceleration has become, you know, an eye-opening experience for all of us, because, you know, people are now questioning schools and hospitals, and not only workplaces, right? Who would think that you at some point would question schools? And in this sort of short period of time that you would have thought, yeah, do you need teachers? Oh, that's going to happen in the very far future. But I mean, our kids have been going to school for the past 4 months without actually physically going to school. So what is learning? How do you go to the office? You know, and a lot of these things are going to be questioned. And I think as much as I sometimes think people will be going back to normal, and human nature tends to be comfortable going back to normal, and yes, we'll go back, but then the itch will come back, and we'll be like, you know what, it was nice when we got to work from to work from home, and we'll start questioning the efficiencies of the types of cities that we've built. And I think that is where it's going to add value to our discussion about sustainability, because is it really sustainable to have schools as big as we have? Like, our schools are now huge. Do we need all of that? Do we need that type of infrastructure? If you can work from home, then, you know, do we need to do this commute? Do we need to have different buildings? Do we need to have all of these things that are, in a way, contributing hugely to global warming?
Yeah, I do agree with, you know, viruses exist since the beginning of time. Viruses have always been, you know, a cause of disruption in workplaces and a lot of, you know, built environments. And I think because the coronavirus was caused such a dramatic shake to the world, because of how contagious and the spread was too fast, that it caused us to, you know, make a dramatic change. And I think these trends that Dara talked about will be taken into a more serious consideration moving forward, and would probably be mandated at a certain point, because everyone would like to limit the spread of disease. Everyone would like to do, you know, as much as they can to sort of you know, contain diseases, and to design spaces that do not easily spread diseases, whether, you know, it's in terms of materials, in terms of spacing, and, you know, moving away from congested spaces, creating bigger pathways, creating pathways for people to walk to, you know, a more pedestrian friendly cities. So I think, you know, we have no choice anymore. We are forced, because of how big of a change the coronavirus was, to implement all of these things moving forward, and to mandate them at a certain level, because it has a serious implication on people, on their well-being, on their health.
Yeah, definitely, for sure.
Najla, do we have 33 questions? Is that what I'm seeing?
That is what you're seeing.
Okay.
One question that I saw, if I can just so quickly. How do you think the approach to sustainability is unique or different in the UAE and the Gulf than international US-based or European approaches? Dara, I think you've been working on both, probably, you know, different parts of the world. Maybe, do you think that it is different? Do you not?
Yeah, I think the emphasis is different. When you're working in climates such as the UAE, you have to think differently about water use, about the way that you treat the sun. But the ingredients, let's say the ingredients are the same, but the proportions are different, if you like. So something that's often said about the European or North American rating systems is they don't really think about life in the UAE quite right, and they don't put enough emphasis on water use. They don't, you know, they give too much weight to certain things that are very difficult here, like, you know, for example, cycling to work, that kind of thing. So we do have to tailor to the local culture and the local environment. That's important. Yeah.
Does anyone else want to add on that, or do we move on to another question? Okay, moving on. Let's see. This is, a lot of the questions are about COVID, surprisingly. One question says, Nada mentioned the integration of design in future should depend on current situation. Her question is, congregation space always been a catalyst as an architect? Do you think we really need to consider social distancing in a design after the pandemic?
Can you just repeat the end of the question? Do I think?
Do you really need to consider, do we really need to consider social distancing in a design after the pandemic?
Well, I think social distancing is both, you know, a good thing and a bad thing. I think it depends on how do you look at it. And, you know, it depends on you if you're more social than others or not, or would you like your buffer zone? I think at a certain degree, and I spoke about, you know, more spacious spaces and reducing, you know, congested spaces. And I think that this will more apply on, let's say, high footfall areas, areas where people, you know, aggregate. And let's say, you know, as you walk into an office building, you know, the entryways, how do you create a more seamless entry? How do you create, you know, how do you negate the need for actually touching a doorknob? How do you integrate, you know, I talked about technology. How do you integrate technology to limit, you know, the physical touch? And I think it's not just it's not just about social distancing. It's also about, you know, surfaces. How do you select surfaces that could be easily, you know, washed down and disinfected and not be, you know, damaged by continuous disinfecting? So there are a lot of variables in design, more about surfaces, more about seamless interaction. And it's not just about, you know, social distancing. I think eventually, and now we see it, you know, the curfew is lifting. I think eventually the social distancing aspect is going to slowly fade away. But I think as designers, you know, we will always have that in mind when we design, you know, office spaces and, you know, decide on distancing between desks, decide on, you know, now we see, you know, these separators coming between desks and things like that. So I think to a certain degree, yes, we would need to integrate that into design in the future. I think there are so many other factors other than just social distancing, because all of those can contribute to the spread of disease, and not just, the close proximity of people.
I think there has to be also like a fine line, I guess, between designing it even in isolation, or having open spaces and everything. There has to be the right.
Because interaction is also, a good thing. It's really, you see people just wanting to, to be around people again. And I think, and that's why I think, it will slowly fade away, and it's in its current state, but would need to be thought of in a different way in the future.
Yeah, definitely. Do you, as an architect, or even as a decision maker, how do you take a more active role in raising awareness towards this topic? Whether it's being, as an architect, and not just having, educational centers as we spoke, but different approaches. Is there any? What do you think?
For me, I think the best way that we can achieve this is just setting an example. Just by doing it and doing it better every time, and then seeing how everyone reacts to it, and seeing how it has sort of evolved our thinking, and then sort of changed the conversation that everyone else is having about the built environment. For me, that's the best way.
Yeah, and I agree with that, Carla. I'd like to just sort of add the idea of education to that as well, and that I think we all have a responsibility to learn about the importance of these subjects. And if you don't know about them, go and read the Sustainable Development Goals. They're amazing, really, so much, and learn about the Paris Climate Agreement. It can be very difficult with all the media noise around to get a kind of clear picture, and just to realize how much work has been done on this.
Yeah, I do agree. I mean, I think, as a first step is to educate. And I think, as much as we know and, we've experienced during the lifetime of our projects, I think we as well need to further our education on these topics. And, things like the UN SDGs is a very good place to start. And I don't think it's just us that need to know about these. I think, the vast majority of society needs to, be aware of the SDGs, and so that, they can apply it in their day-to-day practices, and not just, when it comes to design. It's about, doing the small steps here and there, recycling, reusing, reducing, your consumption, your power, water, and all of these things. And I think, educating yourself, you can start by educating yourself on these, global sort of ideas.
Let's go back to the questions. There's a question on how can we achieve sustainability and produce zero carbon in existing buildings. Also, I'd like to think of that. How can we reach to a point where we're using our buildings to actually, process carbon, eliminate carbon, let's say, be more regenerative, be more restorative, that sort of thing. Does anyone have, any thoughts on that, or how to go forward?
Yeah, the idea of quantification is really, really important. The idea of going back and measuring what you've done and understanding if it really worked or not. So, one thing that comes to mind is the project we did in Abu Dhabi almost 10 years ago called Masdar City. And that was that was a sort of an amazing vision for creating a zero carbon community. And of course, you know, one of the fundamental principles was passive design that we used. So that's all about how do we arrange buildings in a way that minimize, you know, that minimize energy use. And we were inspired by examples of architecture in the region. So we looked at cities, particularly in Yemen, where you had these kind of high-rise, almost like the New York of the ancient world, where these buildings were placed very close together and needed each other. And it's amazing what you can learn from looking back at history, and particularly the history of the region that you're working with and the culture. And so when we designed these spaces in Masdar that were inspired by this sort of vernacular traditional architecture, of course, we did all the computer analysis, we did all the testing, the mock-ups, the simulations, but it was very interesting for us to go back after the project was done, and we took a team from our research department within Foster's, and we took them back to site, and we set up thermal cameras on the site in Masdar, and we compared the temperatures to what you would get in downtown Abu Dhabi, which is planned on a kind of, you know, planned around the motor car, so it's got wide streets, concrete everywhere. And we found really big differences in temperature, up to sort of 10 degrees in the temperature that was experienced in the outdoor spaces. So one of the ways that's really, really important is to go back and test that what you've said, has it really worked? You know, is it really the right solution?
And then Nada, I believe you discussed how like you're using artificial intelligence to do these testings and to measure for the operational phase of the PIA headquarters.
Yeah, so we're integrating technology to help quantify all of these measures, like Dara mentioned. So this is a very important aspect of all buildings, is how do you measure that? And I think, you know, the technology nowadays, like, you know, all of these systems that tell you more about how much you're consuming, how much can you reduce, you know, how much are you using the building during the nighttime, during daytime, nighttime, during different seasons. So it fluctuates, you know, and a building should not just be a flat line. It should also react towards that, because this would help you as a client. This would help you as a, you know, as an inhabitant of that space, to actually understand your consumption levels and how do you reduce them, and how do you work better towards, you know, having a less negative impact on the environment. So I think, you know, understanding that pattern is very important, because otherwise, you know, you think that you're doing great while, you know, you're not necessarily doing the best that you can.
Yeah. So I think we're coming to an end to this amazing discussion. Is there anyone who would like to add any final thoughts regarding the topic? I'll take that as a no. So
I thought Nada wanted to add something.
Yeah,
I could, yeah. I mean,
Go ahead.
I think, you know, on the topic of sustainability and about recycling and about reusing, you know, during this current pandemic, I think there's a great, a big, you know, consumption of masks, of gloves, or of all of these, you know, additional types of waste that's going to be generated. And I just want to urge people about, you know, thinking wisely about their waste, and that, you know, yes, there is a pandemic. Yes, we need to protect ourselves, but also being reasonable about that, because like we saw, you know, the lockdown created, you know, better effects on the environment, but then in retrospect, you know, there is another type of waste that's piling up on the other hand. So I think, you know, we need to think about how do we not just exaggerate in that terms? How do we be reasonable? How do we think about our waste differently, of how can we recycle? There are so many different ways that you can reuse and recycle and limit your waste, and this, you know, helps us, like a waste management company, to control that amount of waste, and to you know, to also raise awareness about how do we better in terms of taking care of our environment.
Thank you so much for that, Nada. I'd like to thank you all for your valuable input, and on behalf of our speakers today and Shuruq's team, I would like to also thank our audience who has joined us tonight for this amazing discussion. Yeah, thank you. Stay tuned for next week's session, and have a great day or night.
Thank you, Najla.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Bye.
Thank you.